and how can we look at the refugees in Lebanon as something of a temporary added value added, rather than a burden. Give them back their agency and their dignity, and give them back the livelihoods that they lost in Syria and that they cannot attain in Lebanon at the moment. As Dr. Kardash mentioned, I work at the Policy Institute, and our work is based on identifying the problems that Syrian refugees are facing in Lebanon and how to alleviate these problems. Since our government is finding it very difficult to deal with this situation, our caretaker finance minister asserted that in order to properly deal with this crisis, we need around $2.6 billion over 3 years, with a primary injection of $450 million into the two main strained sectors of healthcare and education. Lebanon, as of today, has received much less than that. It's received less than 500 million to deal with the crisis. And the main concern that we're finding in our research as well comes back to the host community and refugee tensions that are on the constant rise. And finally, to echo our colleagues' report findings, if Damascus is evacuated, it is actually estimated from our projections that at least 1 to 2 million people will cross into Lebanon in less than 1 week. So it is very important to look at how can we alleviate the Syrian refugee crisis in Lebanon. Obviously, our Arab region has actually witnessed many waves of refugees over the years, and our modern history has been characterized by internally displaced people and refugees. But the severity of the humanitarian crisis in Lebanon now is extremely grave, and this exceptional influx of refugees is posing long-lasting ramifications on Lebanon as a nation and on the refugees themselves. If the Syrian conflict were to end tomorrow, based on our estimations, refugees created by this crisis will not be able to return to Syria for at least half a decade. They've lost their lives, their livelihoods, both in Syria and in Lebanon. And the impact on Lebanon has created enormous concerns. Lebanon and the Syrian refugees are both, and I quote, and these are quotes from representatives of UNHCR and UNRWA in Lebanon, they're suffering under the strain of a refugee crisis now out of control, and we're heading towards a dangerous situation. Now, the history of labor migration and seasonal migration between Lebanon and Syria has been quite common, especially Syrians who are exceptionally skilled and hardworking and considered to be very much valued entrepreneurs in Lebanon, especially in the fields where Syrians are requested to work, such as agriculture and construction. Now, the research that we're currently looking at is twofold. It states that the refugee situation in Lebanon is rapidly reaching the brink of collapse. And this is due to two factors, and I'm trying to keep this brief. We can go into more depth in the questions later. So first, the political, economic, demographic, social, and infrastructural pressures resulting from the refugee influx, and two, the lack of aid from the international community. This research was conducted based on a mixed methods assessment, so qualitative and quantitative work, carefully selected indicators, as well as field work and specific case studies. Now, when it comes to the policy perspective that we suggest the creation of a decentralized management cells or decentralized crisis management teams on a governorate level, and this is echoed in research conducted by my colleague Rabia Shibli at IFI. These crisis management cells on a governorate level, we believe, will be able to act as decision makers in the zones of refugee settlement, and will involve locally trained Syrian and Lebanese individuals. Now, very briefly, based on studies of political science, it's projected that Syria's civil war will most likely last until 2020, and this is due to a number of factors, namely the role of veto players and the presence of numerous participating factions. Obviously, we have started calling this a protracted refugee situation due to these very reasons, contrary to the UNHCR definition of protracted, which states that it's a crude measure of 25,000 people or more who have been in exile for 5 or more years, and we staunchly reject this definition of protracted. Now, When it comes to Lebanon, as of April the 22nd, 2014, so 2 days ago, we have more than 1 million registered Syrian refugees. The United Nations is calling this a devastating milestone. Based on our research, 96% of these registered refugees are living side by side with 66% of the vulnerable Lebanese populations in 225 localities out of around 600 in Lebanon. These localities are mainly in North Lebanon and the Bekaa. And according to Ninette Kelly, the representative of the UNHCR, Lebanon now holds the distinction, quote unquote, of hosting the world's highest number of refugees per capita. So this is just something to digest. Unofficial figures. This echoes the study that was conducted by Orsam. In addition to the present 4.425 million Lebanese which are present in Lebanon, we now have around 1.7 million registered and unregistered Syrian refugees. And when I say Syrian for now, I mean Syrian and Palestinian refugees hailing from Syria. Now in Lebanon, 1 in every 4 is a Syrian refugee. This is an additional 40% to the Lebanese population. Out of these 40%, more than half of them are children. And this is significant because these children have not had access to education for months, if not years. Moving forward, it is very important to quote that the numbers on Palestinian refugees from Syria actually vary. They range from 50,000 to 90,000, and 90% of them are currently unemployed, according to a recent study by Anera. These refugees are mostly thrice refugees. So this is the third time they've faced a refugee situation. The majority of them have moved into the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon, like this picture from Burj al-Barajne. Not only have these Palestinian refugees from Syria lost their livelihoods, but most of them are hailing from Yarmouk. Yarmouk to these Palestinian refugees was their little Palestine. They called it the little Palestine. So to them, it was their attainment of an imagined territory, but in a real location, to quote Benedict Anderson. Coming to Lebanon, they're shocked at the situation that their fellow Palestinians are going through in Lebanon, because in Syria they had access to healthcare, access to education. They were basically treated like any other Syrian citizen, except they were not allowed citizenship and they were not allowed to vote. In Lebanon, one of the most vulnerable and mistreated and marginalized populations are the Palestinian refugees. It is very difficult for them to find work. They are not allowed to buy, they're not allowed to rent. It is very difficult for these refugees to move outside the camps because of an agreement that the Lebanese government has established with UNRWA back in, and with during the Cairo Agreement of 1969. So, when it comes to Syrian refugees and Palestinian refugees from Syria, Lebanon has actually quite a burden to handle. Now, this is just a reflection, our reflection, on how we see the Syrian refugee influx and the impact on Lebanon. There are a number of important factors that need to be highlighted. And the problem is these repercussions tend to overlap. So the political, the economical, the demographical, the social, all of them seem to intertwine and overlap. When it comes to the political repercussions of this crisis, it's important to note that Lebanon has a de facto open border policy. So Lebanon cannot come, the Lebanese government cannot come to an agreement as to whether the border has to stay open or remain closed. And as such, our border obviously remains open to this day. And furthermore, our previous political deadlock, during which we lacked a government for over 300 days, actually prohibited the government of taking on most action towards helping these Syrian refugees, and UNHCR and UNRWA took on this role instead. Furthermore, there is an increased politicization of the conflict, as our colleagues have mentioned before. So, yet again, we lack any sort of policy with respect to Syrian refugees. As our colleagues have mentioned, there are no camps in Lebanon. We cannot come to an agreement as to how to house these refugees. Furthermore, Lebanese tend not to differentiate between the Syrian regime and the past that Lebanon has had with the Syrian regime and the Syrian occupation and Syrian refugees themselves, which is highly problematic and is a direct is a direct, actually, factor that affects the host community and refugee relationship. And finally, there is a fear of the permanent. So as echoed by our Lebanese foreign minister, who unfortunately cited that there is a conspiracy to keep these refugees in Lebanon, or the Maronite patriarch who called for sending back all the Syrian refugees to Syria, even during these dire security situations. You notice this fear of the permanent and what this permanent, quote unquote, effect would have on the demographic and confessional divisions that we have in Lebanese society today. I'm not going to go into a lot of statistics, but basically we're currently expected in Lebanon to have around 6 million total population. ESCWA actually projected that in 2040 we would reach 4.75, and that is a significant increase in population in such a short period of time. Moving on to population ages 0 to 14, the UN has estimated, like I mentioned earlier, at least 500,000 Syrian children have come into Lebanon, increasing the child population figure total in Lebanon to 1.5. And this is why the education sector in Lebanon is one of the most strained at the moment. The current cost of the Syrian crisis to Lebanon is 2.6 billion. And obviously, this has made it extremely hard for Syrian refugees to find work, because using this main heading, the Lebanese government is taking on steps to prohibit the refugees from working in the country. So, for example, a lot of shops that popped up over Beirut that these refugees had opened were closed by the Lebanese government under the pretense that they are affecting the Lebanese economy. The Syrians have obviously felt the brunt of this economic repercussion through the inflations of rent prices and the high cost of living that they're facing in this country. And the rise in demand for public services has obviously resulted in a decline in the refugee access to such services. Very quickly, the Lebanese government has been shifting around a lot of money to help with the Syrian refugee crisis. So they recently shifted around their municipalities' expenditure, which went down from $136 million to $5.3 million. This is a 96.3% decrease. And this money was actually funneled into the two most strained sectors in order to help these refugees, which are the healthcare sector and the education sector. So you really can't say that the Lebanese government is not doing anything. However, they are currently struggling due to the lack of resources that they have and the lack of international aid that they are unfortunately not receiving. Now, government healthcare consumption has increased. This is due to the fact that Syrian refugees are struggling with a number of communicable and non-communicable diseases. And right now, the main concern in Lebanon is polio and vaccinating Syrian refugees. The AUB Medical Center has actually led the campaign in order to provide vaccinations to Syrian refugee children under 3 years old. Now, healthcare spending has increased. Some hospitals in Bekaa are completely out of beds, but I see that as something positive. It means that the hospitals in Lebanon are actually opening up and they're bringing in Syrian refugees, which is good to hear. However, infant mortality has increased significantly, and we've noticed a trend now in Lebanon where Syrian women are choosing to return to Syria. So they take the risk and they return to Syria in order to give birth in Syria. Because not only do they feel it is safer for them to give birth in Syria, but also they find it easier to register their children there. Because if I explain to you how the process in which a Syrian refugee would have to register their child, it would actually be quite a farce. It's long, it's arduous, and it's costly. So it would cost this refugee around $20 in order to register their child, and $20 is a lot for these refugees, keeping in mind that the World Food Program has been giving them stipends of $30 a month for food. So paying $20 to register their children is horrifyingly high. Now, the educational sector is obviously hard-pressed and overextended. It's limiting the capability to serve Syrian students. Part of what we're trying to look at right now at IFI is how to address the problems of increased dropouts and the lack of curriculum overlap. Public schools in Lebanon have now been hosting secondary shifts, so at night, these schools are bringing in Syrian children with Syrian teachers in order to teach them the Syrian curriculum. However, this is not enough, because as we project, the pressures on the education system are estimated to grow rapidly and non-linearly. Put in simpler terms, there are not enough schools to host these refugees, so we'll need to actually build more schools to be able to host all of these refugee children, which are now at around 520,000. And finally, back to the main issue at hand, the host country-refugee relationship repercussions. In some areas, the Syrian refugees outnumber the local Lebanese population, and obviously as a result, the social relations between the refugees and the host communities are tense, and there's a high amount of mutual suspicion. But as our colleagues mentioned, it's mostly economic, because these poor Lebanese envy the food, the limited amounts of food and resources that are given to these refugees, because the Lebanese government is unable to provide them with any aid. They do not perceive this as minimal. To them, it seems that these refugees are getting help, whereas they aren't getting any at all. Obviously, food prices are increasing, rent and property prices are soaring, market conditions, these are all affecting the Syrian refugee populations and are making it increasingly difficult for them to make a living. Marginalized poverty pockets are on the increase, and curfews are being put in place. So I don't know if you've heard of this, but there are a number of municipalities who are limiting the movement of Syrian refugees from the night until the early morning, and they're either directly telling them in billboards and in signs, Syrian refugees are not allowed to move, or it's worded differently, foreign workers are not allowed to move, but everyone knows what this actually means. Moving on very quickly, I'll just take 2 minutes more. I noticed that our colleagues at Orsam used the example of Al-Marj in their report, which is a town near Bar Ilyas, which is in the Zahle area. Like our colleagues said, it is the third most populated area that has accepted Syrian refugees. Looking at Bar Ilyas, it is an area of 35 square kilometers where the population has risen from 50,000 to 100,000 in the span of months. And this has led to a number of tensions between the poor Syrians and the poor Lebanese due to the scarcity of resources in this town. Now, we looked back, and particularly our colleague Rabia Shibli looked back at what happened in the 2006 war and how Lebanon dealt with internally displaced people. And what he came up with and what we suggest and are trying to actually suggest to the Lebanese government is creating governorate-level decentralized crisis management teams. These crisis management teams would answer to the muhafazat, so sort of the provinces that we have in Lebanon, and would actually train these local Lebanese who are poor, who are struggling to find work, and train the Syrians to work in municipal lines. So for example, work in building schools, work in constructing, let's say, places of worship, work in reconstructing or paving roads. And we believe that actually bringing these two communities together would lead to a decrease in the host community and refugee tensions, and actually would result in a change in perception that the Lebanese have towards the crisis. Very quickly, this is just what we think would having the muhafazat as the decision makers and the crisis management units would actually lead to: the alleviation of host community tension and the alleviation of the pressures themselves. Finally, at IFI, we find that it is very important to move away from this idea of Syrian refugees in Lebanon as the permanent burden and bring it back to seeing them as people with temporary added value, who are going to be in Lebanon for a period of time, who deserve to have livelihoods, who deserve to have work, who deserve to have access to healthcare and education. And we hope that our research would actually lead to some sort of alleviation of host community and refugee tensions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rima. Now we move to Professor Osman Ali, who is a great friend and a colleague. He's from Salatin University in Erbil. As Oytun mentioned in the report, most of the Syrian refugees in Iraq are concentrated in the northern part of the country, KRG. So
on few issues. The main argument, I would say, the refugees in Iraq is really 95% of the refugees are in northern Iraq, in Kurdistan area. And the government there, Kurdistan regional government, has really dealt with them in a very exemplary manner. The population and the government, and later on I will explain why. And however, the government there, the infrastructure and lack of expertise is really creating a serious problem, regardless of the goodwill of the population, of the government. In central Iraq, especially in Anbar province, where we have around 20,000 refugees, there the problem is very serious, and the refugees are facing serious difficulties. Now let's go to where about the refugees. Well, first of all, it's very difficult to give an exact number of the refugees. However, UNHCR in January 2014 said we have 210,000 registered refugees of the total Syrian refugees, 10% of the total Syrian refugees in Iraq. And the current estimate, the total at 250,000, and 95% of these are in Kurdistan region and are mostly Kurds. The majority of these are living in urban center, outside the camps. However, there are 16 camps, and the biggest camp is Domes camp, where we have around 60,000 people living. Al-Qaim in the central province of Anbar have 20,000 people. If you look at the map, there you will see most refugee camps are in northern Iraq. We have only one camp, as I said, that is in central Iraq. Where did they came from? If you look at the map again, you will see mostly came from northern or eastern parts of Syria. Al-Hasaka, Aleppo, and Deir ez-Zor. Few came from other places. As Orhan mentioned, the trend is really following a denominational. For example, Sunni Arabs went to the Sunni parts of Iraq, like Anbar, Mosul, part of Kirkuk, and the Kurds went mostly to the Kurdish regions of Iraq. Why did they come to Iraq? Well, the Syrian Kurds were affected by the crisis in the following way. Although Kurdish regions of Syria have been outside the battle zone, however, the situation affected them. First of all, there's no government services in that area. The government withdrew from the area, so we have basic deterioration of the services. For example, I talked to the refugees. They say we don't have electricity. Sometimes 3 days consecutively. And we don't have healthcare anymore. We don't have education service. So that's why they came. Another reason, lack of security and political vacuum. When the government withdrew from the northern part of Syria, from especially Syrian Kurdish areas, PAYA, they took control. The PAYA, that's a Kurdish part, as you notice, an outfit of PKK, really ruling the area in a very totalitarian approach. They are spreading terror. They are recruiting young boys, young girls for their own. They are kidnapping people. So there is an atmosphere of terror. So that's what some people said, that is why we left the area. high inflation, as in Lebanon, as in Jordan. The existence of a high number of refugees have affected the services. For example, in Erbil, now a piece of land is much more expensive than in Washington and New York because of the many other reasons and the Syrian presence. And the food is very skyrocketing in inflation. Another factor why the people came from Lebanon is the continuous clash between PYD militia and militant Islamic group like Al-Nusra and other groups. Sometimes villages being burned or bombarded or attacked by it. So the people will leave out of it. Of course, government, another factor will be government aerial attack on small towns, even sometime on Hasaka, there's Aleppo. So the population are going. Search for better job opportunities. This is another factor. Some refugees are coming there hoping that they can find a better job because in Kurdistan region, it is a very prosperous area. And they are coming for job, they find job, they work for a while, then they go back. And sometimes they receive some items as a help in a refugee camp, then they take it back and they go back. Now, if we present the government attitude and the population, as I said, the government of Kurdistan, Kurdistan regional government is giving them what you call it, residency permits, which allows them the freedom of movement, the right to work legally, access to healthcare and primary education. I'm a professor at university. We have many Syrian students in the camp, in the university. They are treated just like other Iraqi Kurds. And in the high schools, the Syrian Kurdish children are there, and in the primary education. The Kurdish population have expressed profound solidarity. Why? In my reason, there are two reasons. First, they are ethnic Kurds like them. Another reason, most Iraqi Kurds have experienced what you call it, being refugees in Turkey. You remember in 1988, in 1991, in Iran. So they understand, they have experienced this. So that's another reason why they welcome. Now, another reason why the Kurdistan regional government welcoming them is the rivalry between Masoud Barzani and Abdullah Öcalan for the leadership of the pan-Kurdish movement. Masoud Barzani's party hopes that they can recruit from this big pool people for their own party. And in fact, they are doing it extensively in the region. They have trained, according to some statistics, around 10,000 of them. That's a reserve army which may, at due time, planning to move back with Kurdistan. Now, the difference between Iraqi government and Kurdistan regional government is that basically the Iraqi government, in their declared policy, saying that we have around 1 million people of our many wars which are displaced, internally displaced. We have now a sectarian war going on. The coming of the refugees who are mostly Sunnis are going to affect the balance, are exasperating that situation. They are saying, when we allow them to come, Daesh is coming with them, Nusra is coming with them. So they really confine them to one camp, and in many times, in many occasions, they return them to Syria under a very dangerous situation. They don't allocate money. For example, Kurdistan government says, allocate us money. They don't give that money to the Kurdistan government, Kurdistan regional government. Now, if you look at in this map here, we have a big pool of the partners with Kurdistan regional government. This includes many international organizations like UNAMI, and then also European refugees, helping organizations, Danish Refugee Council, Swedish Refugee Council have an organization called Dijla And also many Islamic groups are working there, like Islamic Relief. And then if you look at the very end, we have Barzani Foundation, which is the most prominent charitable organization to channel public work. And there is one more particular thing about Kurdistan region, is that the Islamic groups in the area have really used the satellite TV, the mosques, to start a very big campaign called Bakhshin in Kurdish to help the Syrian refugees. And they really did a great work in that area. The effects, there are social consequences, economic and political. Social consequences. Initially, the population were very enthusiastic, very warm, but this is the case with the refugees. As they stay longer in all host countries, the population becomes cooler and sometimes turns negative. So why in Kurdish areas especially? The social consequence, the Kurdish population in Erbil and to some extent in Duhok and Suleymania are very tribal, very conservative. They are not accustomed, for example, to the prostitution. They are not accustomed to begging or stealing. Now in Erbil, every household, they say, oh, be careful. There are Syrian refugees around and they are stealing all that thing. So that's really creating what you call a kind of hatred. A survey was done in March 2003. 37% of population are saying, let them go back. Don't accept anymore. So this is really what you call it. Of course, when we come to the economic consequences, the same thing as was mentioned in what you call it in Jordan and in Turkey and in Lebanon. The high inflation impacting the housing rent, rental, labor force are saying now we cannot work. I have seen many taxi drivers, many people say we cannot work because the labor force is taken by the Syrian. So this is creating resentment. Now, if we come to the political and security spillover in Iraq, this is the most serious. Iraq has, as I said earlier, a very what you call fragile situation. A sectarian war is going on, and the presence of the Sunni refugees from Syria to the parts of central provinces of Iraq has, and the lack of support from the central government for them has created animosity on the part of Iraqi Sunni towards the central government, because saying, look, they don't take care of them because they are Sunnis. And also, with the refugees, sometimes the government of Iraq is quite right. Some terrorists are coming, and therefore, this is creating a problem. How it affects the Kurdish situation, even there we have some spillovers in a negative way. For example, intra-Kurdish fighting. Now, Iraqi Kurdish opposition, especially what you call it, PUK and Goran, which is a very emerging, very powerful, they are saying the central government is not doing well because KDP is in problem with PKK, with PYD, so they are not. So they are mobilizing the PUK and Goran, mobilizing the street against Masoud Barzani. And there are a lot of demonstrations going on, and the fact that Masoud Barzani recently put on several occasions closing the what you call it, the doors, that has increased the resentment of many Kurds. And also lately the government decided to build a ditch of 600 kilometers, and that has also created a lot of controversy between the KDP and other Kurdish parties. So there might be some spillover. What is needed to be done? And that's the last part, but before that, I would like here to, Nathan Pollock wrote a report, an article on foreign policy in August 10, 2012. And he wrote something I would like to to read it to you. It's really, what you call it, it's a very important point. Look what he says about the refugees. He says, in addition to their own misery, refugees can create serious and even devastating problem for the nation hosting them. The plight of the Palestinian refugees and their impact on Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria since 1948 is a case in point, contributing to the instability in their host country. International terrorism, war between Israelis and its neighbor. Beyond this, refugees can often become carrier of conflict. Angry and demoralized refugees population represent ideal recruitment pools for the warring armies. The Taliban were drawn from angry young Afghan refugees raised in Pakistan, offering them a chance for vengeance and power. Indeed, the refugee camps frequently became the basis to arrest, plan, and stage combat operation back into the country from which they. For instance, the camp sent in Democratic Republic, from there, groups started the genocide. So this tells us the refugee crisis in the host countries, regardless how much goodwill, regardless how much we do, actually it is not going to address the main issue. So what I suggest is really a holistic approach. What means a holistic approach? The refugee crisis is a result. It is a consequence. What we need is really a political decision. And in my understanding, no-fly zone is really, the buffer zone is the only option, and that should really, what it means to consolidate framework and spaces to lodge Syrian refugees on Syrian territories, to lodge them on Syrian territories in safe zone outside the reach of the ongoing conflict. I am not asking here for a refugee zone like in Libya, but what I am asking is like what we did in northern Iraq in 1991, the Hamar and Skill, where the refugees were in a safe place and really addressed the issue. The enormosity and the size of the crisis and of the human suffering. As Dr. Fuad said, the Europeans are not really, the statistics he gave, are not willing to share, taking them to third countries like 10,000 or even 20,000. It's not going to address it. So what we really need is a no-fly zone approach, and I think that should be taken. I would just quickly, 2 more minutes, address a few things which I really read in another report, and I would like to draw your attention. It says, to coordinate with from what you call it, Brookings Institute, Brookings LSE project. They really made a good symposium on the same issue. I hope that will be taken. They have also a lot of recommendations, which I hope you people will take into consideration. United Nations High Council should work with the government, humanitarian stakeholders, and donors in Iraq to provide protection and durable solution for people of concern. Priority areas will be advocacy, legal and protection intervention, basic assistance and support to IDPs in newly protracted displacement situation, as well as capacity building of government and nation and national non-governmental organization. Briefly, I have several other, recommendations. For Iraq, the central government needs to give more aid to the refugees. They need to take seriously the issue of refugees. They have to keep open door for the Sunni Arabs who are coming to West Central provinces. They also should allocate more money to the to the Syrian refugee camps in the north. The international donor also should be involved in integrating these refugees, addressing their immediate and long-term solutions, because we don't know how long these people will be there. And there are many issues which need to be addressed, and thank you very much.
She has to be sort of economical in her use of time, and then
Okay.
we might also have some time for a Q&A session.
Okay.
And you will be using that
Yes.
PowerPoint, and it is up running. The point
No, well, I'm sorry if I have to pass quickly my slides because there are a lot, so allow me to make a brief summary of how I'm going to talk about the situation of Syrians in Turkey, and as well as how the situation is actually important in the context of Turkey's increasing it has actually become a pressing policy issue even before the eruption of the Syrian crisis, because Turkey has become a very important transit and destination country for irregular migrants, which I'm going to show in a bit. And we, of course, have the new law, the law on foreigners and international protection, which also has an important implication in the context of Turkey's management of migration. So these numbers have already been discussed by the previous presenters, but perhaps I should emphasize that the numbers will reach 1,300,000 by the end of 2014, according to the UNHCR. And I think it hasn't been mentioned, the female-male ratio is almost equal. And the largest age group, according to AFAD's findings, is the working age group of people between 18 and 54. And this is valid for both urban refugees living in city centers and also for the people, for the Syrians residing in the camps. So since 29th of April, since the start of the population movement from Syria to Turkey, Turkey has pursued open border policy, but when we refer to open border policy, this implies that the people who are passing the border needs to have some certain traveling documents like the passports, and the border police only allows in urgent cases of people who enter without these documents. So this also brings another issue. Many Syrians are seeking help from human smugglers. They're paying them to get into Turkey. I don't have the statistical data, but this has been an issue that has come up in discussions with Syrians. And you have already heard about the total spending. Okay, here is I think this hasn't been shown either. So this is actually the distribution of people, of Syrians in the most populated camps, in the most populated cities. So as you can see, for instance, Mardin is not, Mardin is on there's only one camp in Mardin, which is on the 11th, I think ranking 11th, but the number of urban refugees is a lot. So there is no such correlation between having a refugee camp and having a refugee camp and urban refugees. My city, Adana, is not, actually these are not very accurate figures. I took them from AFAD, but according to people I have talked to, the numbers are around 30,000. So this actually brings up to the most important issue, the registration issue. There are almost 1/3 of Syrians currently in Turkey are not registered. So this is an important fact. And even if the numbers of refugees are not very, even in those cities where the percentage is only 2.7, this still makes an important implication on the population rate, affecting the employment, job sectors, and societal structures, and so on. So I will very quickly try to emphasize that since the 1990s, since the early 1990s, Turkey has actually changed a lot in terms of its migration profile. It was already an immigrant country since the 1960s, but now it's a transit and a destination country, mostly for transit migration, irregular labor migration, and asylum flows. And even though we don't have any statistical data on these separate forms, apprehension figures by the police officers give us some estimates, and this is the average between 1995 and 2009 is about 55,000 people are apprehended by the border guards when trying to illegally pass the borders. When did this become an important issue? Of course, since the EU has intensified its pressures on Turkey to adopt a more strategic approach to migration management. And in the last year, as you might have all observed, two important developments took place. One is the adoption of the new law, and the second one is the signing of the readmission agreement. Perhaps we can discuss this in the question and answer part, but since there are also a lot of Syrians who are now trying to pass to European Union via Turkey using illegal means, this is also going to have an implication on Turkey, because in the next 3 years, the EU will start sending of those people who are passed through Turkey. So this is another aspect of the problem, which Turkey needs to consider. So now there is a new law, but obviously the lawmaking process did not, I mean, the people who were involved in the lawmaking process, that was what Dr. Kardesh was referring to, a recent study I have conducted with the actors who were involved in the lawmaking process. Obviously, they did not foresee the coming Syrian refugee crisis, so there's not much emphasis on mass regulation of mass flows of migration. Since 2011, actually, the government has adopted the temporary protection regime for the Syrians. So before, almost all policymakers were referring to the Syrians as guests, but it did not really have a correspondent in international law. So now they're covered under the temporary protection regime, which also has a place in the new law. This is actually, I mean, okay, it has a place in international law, but mostly it's an issue that has been developed in the European Union law. So what are some current challenges for camp refugees? Oops. I'm sorry, I'm testing from here and I'm thinking that you were already, I'm so sorry. Trying to be fast and that doesn't really help. Okay, sorry. So this is the temporary protection. Because I'm passing from here, I'm feeling like I'm also passing from there. So this is what the temporary protection entails. So basically, whether a Syrian refugee is registered or not in Turkey at the moment, they're all part of the temporary protection regime, which means that they have free access to healthcare. If they're registered, they actually can enroll their kids to schools in local areas and so on. But obviously, I'm not entirely sure whether this has been already abolished, but this was the case, as you have mentioned in your presentation as well. There was a registration fee, which was about 200 Turkish liras, and most Syrian families were not able to pay this fee for every single individual member of their family, and the most of the Syrian people I have talked to are not even aware that they have to register in order to benefit from these rights. So there's kind of a lack of coordination, but now Dr. Oktay has mentioned that they're trying to improve the system. So I have worked in the camp in Adana. It was opened last year, and at that time the population was about 9,000. Now it has increased to 11,452. The camp in Adana is special in the sense that there is 24/7 health services, including doctors, on-site emergency. I mean, it has a very comprehensive healthcare unit. And the people seemed more settled after a year. I mean, they seemed more adapted. Just like in any other camps, there are education facilities and so on. There were some presence of epidemic diseases, which I'm not sure whether you're aware, but the government is trying to control these through vaccination campaigns immediately after the refugees arrive in the camps. Well, as you know, the camps have been praised by all, I mean, international community, the international media for being like 5-star hotels as providing these standards. But obviously, it's a matter of question how long Turkey will be able to actually provide these standards, since we know that the international aid is not really matching what Turkey has been offering so far. And most camps are full. This is another fact. I'm not sure whether maybe this conflicts with what Dr. Oktay says, but there are actually people who want to go into camps, but they have been refused because of the situation that they're full. But obviously, for urban refugees, the problem is even more acute. So the registration problem I have already mentioned. Since September 2013, they have exactly the same rights in terms of accessing public health care as any Turkish citizen. Some of the Syrians I interviewed, they have raised that the problem of translation, like the hospitals, the public hospitals do not have translators, so they're not able to communicate effectively. And also, sometimes the administration people in the hospital are not very hospitable, so they refuse to be given treatment and so on. In relation to employment problems, I'm sure you have read about the exploitation in the labor markets. In the case of Adana, for instance, a Syrian person receives 10 Turkish liras, whereas a Turkish person who's doing the same job in a construction site receives 40 Turkish lira, which probably needs to be dealt more effectively at the local level by the authorities, because now Turkey has the comprehensive legal framework to deal with, to combat with labor exploitation. And societal problems I haven't encountered much in my research, to be honest. From the perspective of Syrians, they were quite happy and actually quite thankful to the Turkish society. This was very often raised. In the host community, on the other hand, more than hostility, especially in my city, the problem is lack of awareness. Most people are just not aware that their Syrians need help, and I blame the media because they mostly just talk about whether the Syrians get the voting rights or not, but not really focus on the essential of the problem, which is a very humanitarian issue. So as a university, we're trying to conduct some projects in order to raise awareness, but obviously this is not something that should be multiple. How many minutes do I have? 1. Okay, I think, yeah, this is a photo I took yesterday. This is a photo I took yesterday. This actually, okay, maybe I should just emphasize this and conclude. Education is probably the most important and urgent issue because, I mean, yes, Dr. Oktay also mentioned that they're doing certain projects, but I mean, these kids have not been to school for 3 years, which is already an important issue, and Syrians are not going to leave anytime soon, so this is a problem of Turkey. Like, there needs to be a comprehensive education policy. This school, there are actually 3 schools in Adana. I mean, they're educating about 1,000 Syrian students, 2 secondary schools and 1 high school. They're totally conducted on voluntary basis. They have Syrian teachers who are working on voluntarily. They're not receiving any salary, so this is a major issue because they're obviously not able to work anywhere else. So I'm sure that if there's enough awareness in Turkey, perhaps certain civil society organizations could also initiate projects like this, and at least we can help them to learn Turkish, maybe, which would be useful, or English, whatever. So, yep, this is my final point. Thank you very much for listening, and have a great lunch.
Thanks a lot. Speaking of exploitation of labor, our translators have been doing an excellent job, but they have gone overtime, and we have been holding the workshop without any break. So from that point on, we are going to continue mostly in English, so we can also relieve them of their duties so that they can take a break. But speaking of translation, I also would like to thank to Eya Sultan. We are going to also be releasing the Arabic version of the report. She has done the translations. And one of Orsam staff, Habib Hürmüzdü, he also edited the Arabic. I also would like to thank them as well. Now, I am opening the workshop to your questions and reflections on the presentations. Please.
I'd like to ask the presenter from Lebanon, what percentage of the Syrian children in Lebanon are able to go to school?
I do have some recent statistics here, just a second. I mean, it's a question of are able or who are actually going to school and who are not. So, just a second. So, non-school age children, out of 520,000, there's 120,000. I have numbers, not percentages, sorry. Out of these 520,000, there are only 90,000 currently in school. Yeah. And there are 310,000 children out of school. This is due to a number of factors. Very briefly, I'll tell you. One of the foremost being the fact that these refugees are not finding these schools close to where they're staying. As you know, they're scattered all over Lebanon. Part of what we are trying to do and what AUB is trying to do is establish temporary housing units which can be turned into schools so that these students that are out of school, these 310,000 kids which are on the rise, a figure that's on the rise, would be able to actually attend schools taught by Syrian teachers that are in close proximity to where they are staying.
I'm interested in similar information from Iraq as well, if the students there are able to attend school and if you know percentages.
I personally don't have what you call it exact statistics, but most of them do attend, and they are integrated in the existing, what you call it, Kurdish education system. But the only problem is these are Syrian, and they have been taught in Arabic. So they have opened several Arabic schools too, in Erbil, Duhok, and Suleymaniye for them. But most children are indeed registered in the schools.
Can I add something? The legal status of the Syrian refugees in Iraq are differing in Kurdistan region and in the central government. In Kurdistan region, they have a right to attend all services which the government gives actually. They have right to attend the schools, they have right to take health services, everything. But regarding the central government, it is different. They are not considered as refugees from the point of central government. But as our colleague said, in Kurdistan region, they have right to attend the schools, all Syrian refugees.
I'll just add something. We have statistics actually on before 2011, just to put things into perspective. So before 2011, 93% of children in Syria had primary education, which is staggeringly high. 67% had secondary education. In 2013, 90% of children between the ages of 6 and 17 were estimated to be out of school. But it's also important to note, and I think our colleagues that in their findings also reported this, that it's significantly easier for university-level students to actually enter into the educational system in Lebanon than these primary kids, because these students who are entering into the higher level educational system have had the A-levels, O-levels, higher backgrounds that unfortunately the refugee children that used to attend public schools in Syria that were only taught in the Arabic language, which is a big problem for most of the bilingual schools, particularly the bilingual public schools in Lebanon. So, yeah, it's quite a mess.
Normal kayıt yapılabiliyor. Yani eğitimde de bir sıkıntımız yok şu etapta.
Bu ilave için teşekkürler. Zaten
Ayrıca,
Sayın Başkanımız da bunları vurgulamıştı.
Ayrıca bir şey daha soracağım. Üniversitelere bildiğim kadarıyla Suriyeli öğrenciler kayıt oluyor. Yani eğitimlerine devam ediyor. Ancak çifte vatandaşlar üniversitelere kabul edilmiyor. Bu konuda bilginiz var mı? O konuda cevap isteyeceğim.
Çifte vatandaşlık konusunda bilgim yok. Sadece ilkin üniversiteye gönderdiği düzenleme var. Onunla da her sene her bölüm bir kontenjan veriliyor ve o sayıda Suriyeli öğrenci var.
Bu konuda çalışma yapabilir misiniz? Yani bizim vatandaşlarımız yani Suriye'de doğup büyüyen ancak hem Suriye vatandaşı hem Türk vatandaşı olan insanlar şu an mağdur durumda.
Onu tabii ki de yapayım, o zaman bir araştırayım. Teşekkürler.
Yes, with respect to the economic consequences of the Syrian crisis on the law. Since we learned already, and most of us are aware of that already, that this will be affected crisis lasting, and we are even vague now, at least until 2020. Meaning that there will be a lot of people outside of Syria also sitting sort of idle camps or outside camps. Now my question is on the economic factors. You mentioned it as well. I understand from the professor from Iraq that in Iraq people have a work, can go to work, they have a work permit. That is not the case in all the countries. There is not yet, as far as I understand, in Turkey there is discussion of this. We also learned that there is a big difference between people, Turkish workers and Syrian workers, probably because of the fact that the Syrian workers are not working according to the rule properly illegally without work permit. So can you tell us, well, all four of you, how this compares? And I'm specifically, also since we are in Turkey, interested in the latest developments with respect to Turkey.
Okay, another question, then we collect all the questions and then there are round of answers from speakers.
Thank you. Henry from British Embassy. I'd like to have a supplementary to Hogarth's question about the economic effects. In your report, and you have alluded to in the presentations, you talked about the possible positive aspects of this considerable migration, the positive economic aspects. You probably won't outweigh the negatives, but I don't think anyone really expanded on what those are. So we've got capital transfer, skills transfer, energy, working groups, things like that. It's addressed a little bit in the Jordanian chapter of your report, and it's definitely addressed in the conclusions. But it would be helpful, I think, to think about the question. Also, the second question, my own, in your report you very correctly point to the need to integrate and deal with, on a long-term sustainable basis, Syrian communities, which is a very welcome conclusion, and we want to make policymakers. What early signs have you seen on this, and how open are critical for societies to deal with it?
I'm familiar with the difficulties of accessing the camps and gathering statistics, especially in the case of Turkey. Well, what came to my attention is that in the recipients' countries there were statistics, very good statistics on the attitudes of the host society towards Syrian refugees. I was wondering if there are any studies that you conducted and any surveys, yes, because I haven't seen anything like that, but in the context we see a lot of stuff on that, and it's very important, you know, how the intergroup relations aspect of the issue really
Okay, now the round of answers.
Just a couple of sentences.
Okay.
Just a couple of sentences. I would like to re-emphasize what Dr. Rossi said. To make a correct assessment of the issues, we cannot talk about the total numbers, but relative numbers. Number of refugees per person, per capita, and total of GDP of our countries. So that's an important issue. One something about the labor market. According to some studies recently done on the basis of small samples, the labor market issue is not as big as they have been knowing here. It's mostly related with the lower level jobs and very few sectors of the local economies. But in the short and long run, what will happen? Not in Turkey, if our Turkey is an 80 million population country and we have, thank God, about $900 billion of GDP. But in Lebanon and Iraq and Jordan, what will happen in the medium term and long term, since the number of population will increase, per capita capital per person will decrease significantly in those countries. Total labor productivity is determined by the amount of capital per person per labor, so that in those countries total productivity will decrease, and it will be harder for those countries to increase the GDP, specifically per capita GDP growth rates in the newly managed longer. Thank you.
It's a very brief modeling of
Okay, so just to go back to the questions of the economy and whether these opportunities rather would outweigh the cons. When it comes to the economy, I would direct you to the World Bank report that was issued in 2013 by request of the Lebanese government called the Economic and Social Assessment of the Syrian Crisis on Lebanon, which includes a very detailed economic assessment of the economic losses and effects that the Syrian refugee influx is causing to Lebanon. In our research, we try to look to alternative sources to see, how this crisis is affecting the economy. By the end of this year, 2014, losses to Lebanon's economic activity may reach 7.5 billion. Very quickly, Lebanese economic growth has been cut by 3%. 2013, which is very high actually. Back in 2013, the Beirut Stock Exchange dropped 15% in the first 2 quarters of 2013 actually. Government expenditure has surged in 2013. By the end of 2013, it reached 1.1 billion, and this is directly due to the surge in the demand for public services. So, like I mentioned in my presentation, the Lebanese government has been shuffling around funds. These are from the fiscal reports of the Ministry of Finance, which you can find online. So for now, the total fiscal impact, I would estimate, has reached over 3 billion if we're talking up until today. That's very brief, but we can discuss this one.
How much is the budget of the government here? See?
See, that's it. Our budget has clearly changed. I cannot give you an estimate currently at the moment, simply because we've seen radical shifts in our expenditure and
more than 30%. The cost to the Lebanese government is more than 30% of their budget.
In response to your question, the reason why there's a lot of data available on the camps in Iraq and Lebanon and Jordan is because they're, if correct me if I'm wrong, but they're most managed by UNHCR. So this, and in Turkey, UNHCR does not play any management role, but instead coordinating role, handling repatriation process and so on. Yes, it is very hard to get into the camps, and this has been criticized by international in many international platforms. We have recently applied to the TÜBİTAK project, got all necessary permissions to access almost all the camps, and hopefully we will get it. It's with Özyeğin University, with Professor Dünür Ahmet. We're going to look at in a very comprehensive approach from humanitarian to security, border aspects, and so on. So hopefully we'll be able to deliver some issues on that. And in response to your question about whether the Syrians are allowed to work, because
status is under the temporary protection regime, this has to be dealt with extra legislation that needs to be adopted by the Council of Ministers, which has not been done yet, which has been done but has not been shared with the public. So there needs to be some additional implementing approach to this, or maybe they could be considered within the general framework of the new law, because the new law actually allows asylum seekers and refugees to be employed in Turkey. So this is a bit of a moment. I'm not sure whether there's anyone who can answer that. Thank you.